Chapter 5 discusses, first of all, energy expenditure and how to measure how much energy someone is spending. And then in the second half of the chapter, various mechanisms by which a body can become fatigued are discussed. Now, one of the ways that you can measure things, because eventually we're going to be measuring the amount of energy a body spends, one way to measure things is directly. And I'm excited because I just ordered a new mouse, and the mouse is going to be like a pen. So I'll be able to, I'm like doing this with my fingers on my mouse pad, but hopefully on Wednesday, I'll be able to have a little bit even clearer presentation. But there's a couple of different ways to measure something. Number one is to measure it directly. And then another way is to measure things indirectly. So let's try to come up with a simple example. I guess what we could do is we could look at the size of someone's foot. And if we directly measured someone's foot size, then we would actually just take a measurement of the actual length of their foot in probably like inches or something. And then you would directly measure this variable in inches, say, for instance. All right. But you could also measure this indirectly, because sometimes one variable is related to another variable. So I guess you could look at somebody's height, and you could make an inference that because they're tall, they probably have a bigger foot size than somebody else who is shorter. And this would be a way of indirectly measuring someone's foot size. Now, it's not going to be exact, and there's also always going to be some type of error in this particular assessment, because this assessment is an estimate. So an indirect measurement is always going to have some type of error, because you're not measuring exactly what it is you're trying to measure. So there are ways of directly measuring the amount of energy that somebody spends, but they're really difficult to do. So the chapter is going to recommend indirect measurements. And we can indirectly measure energy using things like the amount of the volume of oxygen that you're consuming, because eventually you're going to burn oxygen down into ATP, which is energy. So if you're using more oxygen, you're spending more energy. So there are ways of using the byproducts and the products of exercise and measure their volumes and estimate energy expenditure. There's another way to estimate energy expenditure. We talked about it last week. It was this equation. It's one of the most, I think, important equations in all of exercise physiology. The resting metabolic rate is equal to 500 plus, in parentheses, 22 times your fat-free mass. And remember, the fat-free mass is the amount of muscle or the amount of tissue in your body that is not fat. So it's fat-free mass, and this is in kilograms. So this is a way to estimate resting metabolic rate. You're obviously not measuring the amount of energy that somebody is spending directly. You're relating the amount of fat mass and fat-free mass that this individual has, because muscle mass burns energy. So the more muscle mass you have, the more energy you're going to burn. So this is another indirect measurement of energy. The last part of the chapter talks about fatigue. And there are many different causes of fatigue. Some of them have to do with fuel. Some of them have to do with ATP. Some of them have to do with brain function. Some of them have to do with muscle timing. Some of them have to do with rest. Some of them have to do with heat and environmental conditions. Some of them have to do with all sorts of different causes of fatigue, not just lactic acid. All right, so that's what the chapter discusses. And in the discussion, the chapter is broken down into the following structure. Chapter 5 starts by a discussion of how to actually measure energy expenditure. The easiest way that you're going to want to do it is go online, right? Type in some type of energy expenditure internet search. I did energy X. This is on YouTube. Just here, it used to be Calorie Lab, but energy expenditure activities, calories, something like that. And then you'll get this, something like this, calories, energy expenditure chart and calories per minute. I don't even know if this is going to work, but something like this, like cleaning, playing the pool, and you figure out how many calories per minute, depending upon your body weight. So you're gonna have to find something like this. MyFitnessPal app has a really good energy expenditure section to it. So you can pretty much type in any exercise and measure the amount of energy that that exercise is spending. It's always gonna be in calories per minute or calories per hour. And there's a difference between the energy at rest and the energy at, during exercise. There's 3 different forms of energy. The first form, or usage of energy rather, in the human body is your resting metabolic rate. So you're spending energy on a couple of different things. You're spending energy on all of the stuff that you need to function and live, which is just, let's get rid of that, which is your heart beating, circadian rhythms in your eyes, intercostal muscles helping with breathing. And this is all the energy that you're spending just to keep your body alive. Your resting, or your basal metabolic rate. Then there's energy that your body spends for digestion. All of the churning of the muscles in your stomach and in your intestines, and the breakdown of carbohydrate and protein and fat, that all is moving food, moving substrate through your intestines, and movement requires energy. So if all of these substrates are going to be moving through your gastrointestinal tract, that's going to require energy. And that's called the thermodynamic effects of food. Usually it'll be the thermodynamic effects of food. It'll be sometimes abbreviated, the thermodynamic effects of food. And then the last thing that you're spending energy on are your activities of daily living, or your like external energy expenditure, ADLs, or your external energy expenditure. It's EEE. External energy expenditure. And that's everything from walking, reading, sitting, running, running, gymnastics, all of it, all of the other stuff. So it's whatever you do at rest, total rest, whatever you do with your food consumption and everything else. That's where you're spending your energy. So during exercise implies probably this third tier of energy expenditure. And like I said, the chapter talks about fatigue and its various causes of fatigue. Again, feel free to interrupt at any time if you have any questions. So one way to measure energy expenditure is, as the slide suggests, is to directly measure it. That means somebody is going to do exercise and you're going to measure the amount of energy that that exercise creates. And energy is either in the form of light, heat, sound. In this case, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be measuring the heat energy that is lost when somebody does exercise. And when I do exercise, that muscle contraction results in the creation of ATP, but only 40% of the carbohydrate, protein, and fat that is broken down is used for ATP. The rest is actually inefficiently lost as heat. And we've spoken about it before. That's the whole point of shivering. Micro contractions that result in the burning of ATP, but also the 60% loss of heat that increases body temperature. I think it's SHIVER, pretty sure. The more energy that's spent, the more heat that's going to be produced. And you can measure all of that heat loss directly with a thing called a calorimeter. The next slide will explain it. It's based on the change in temperature of water as it flows through the walls of this chamber here. So you have somebody running. Let's blow this up a little bit. And they're running in this room, and the room is equipped so that there's this chamber of cold water that surrounds the room. And when this particular individual exercises, there's a loss of heat into the environment, and that's going to increase the temperature of the water from its starting point to its end point. And eventually the water temperature is the output. So the input is the temperature of the water at its coldest state, and then the output is the temperature of the water as it leaves the chamber. And you can measure the change in temperature as the direct measurement of heat production. The increase in body temperature inherent to the increase in energy production is going to result in some type of increase in water temperature. Now, this is very accurate. This is probably the gold standard in any type of caloric assessment. Gold standard is the most accurate one that you can have. So it's very accurate, and it's good for resting metabolic measurements. So for somebody not exercising to their highest intensity, but I don't have one of these pieces of equipment at Assumption College. So you have to buy the equipment. You have to train somebody to use the equipment. You have to have the lab space, not only the equipment, but the lab space. You have to have the computer that's going to, plug into the software. You have to have somebody to train. So although it's very accurate and it's, the best way to measure calories, it's just too cumbersome to be able to use. That's a big problem with a lot of the assessments in exercise physiology. And one of the big problems that I found in the lab that we have is that the lab that we have, the equipment is somewhat older. So it's difficult I don't have, hydrostatic weighing. I don't have good skin calipers. So I had to find a way around all of those limitations. But I mean, we're able to do it. And I'll be able to teach you heart rate, blood pressure, and all of those things without those pieces of equipment. But equipment is a big con in terms of using gold standard means of measuring many different things. So what we're going to do is we are going to measure things indirectly. And the way to indirectly measure calories that are expended is through the byproducts of the energy that we're spending. And when I burn energy, usually what's going to happen is I'm going to be producing carbon dioxide and I'm going to be using oxygen. So maybe what I can do is compare the amount of oxygen brought in with the amount of carbon dioxide produced as a measurement of my energy that's expended. And that is, in fact, what people do. A term that you should be aware of is this VO2 here. This is the volume of, and what this means is per minute. So it's the volume of oxygen consumed per minute. Same thing, the volume of carbon dioxide consumed per minute. So this is calculated by the volume of air that's drawn into the lungs, and more specifically, the volume of the inspired oxygen, because air is more than just oxygen. And you subtract that, or you subtract from that the volume of expired O2. Now I'm going to get an estimate of the amount of oxygen that I used to do that particular exercise during that particular breath. And likewise, I'll get the same value for my volume of carbon dioxide produced per minute. And I can use these in an equation to estimate indirectly VO2 max. And the way that you would capture those things is in a laboratory. And you'll notice here, I wish I could blow this up so that you could see it. But on here is going to be his breathing rate here. Over here is going to probably be his steps per second, or his velocity, or his heart rate. One of these is going to be his resting metabolic rate, is RMR, respiratory exchange ratio is RER, and a bunch of other different variables. And you'll notice he's running on the treadmill here. This is a direct capture of oxygen, meaning he's got an oxygen mask. There's the end of this tube here has a like a gasket, and as he breathes in, it pulls this rubber gasket this way and opens up this vent to allow air to come in, oxygen to come in. Notice he's got a nose clip here, so no air can come in his nose or out of his nose. And he's got another gasket right here. So once the air comes in and he breathes out, the gasket pushes this way and stops air from exiting. But another gasket here opens when he breathes out, and it forces the expired air this way. So no expired air can escape. Only air can shuttle through the tube this way. So he breathes in air, atmospheric air, it's processed, and he breathes it out. And that expired air goes into this computer down here, into the computer. And this cart here, this metabolic cart, can read all of these particular variables. All right, so this is a direct measurement of VO2 max, or the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide that's used. And now that I know how much, what the volume of oxygen compared to the volume of carbon dioxide, I can plug it into these Haldane transformation equations. I'm never going to ask you this equation ever. And you can get an estimate of your expired VO2. Now, this is known as your respiratory exchange ratio, the ratio of oxygen consumed versus carbon dioxide produced. And the respiratory exchange ratio is going to be a value between, say, for instance, 0.7 and 1.5 or a little bit higher. So what do those values mean? Well, depending upon what's being burned as fuel or oxidized, remember oxidation, and this is only talking about carbohydrate, protein, and fat with the presence of oxygen inside the mitochondria. So this is slow glycolysis. Some molecules are more complex than others, and if that's the case, they're going to need more oxygen or more fuel to burn them up. So you'll notice glucose is C6H12O6. Only has 6 carbon molecules. It's the simplest sugar there is. So it doesn't take a huge amount of energy to burn glucose. But palmitic acid, it has 16 carbons. So you'll notice that there's probably going to be much more oxygen needed to break this more complex molecule up. And the ratio of the amount of oxygen needed versus carbon dioxide produced is going to give us a value that can be used for us to understand which type of fuel is being used. Is glucose being used, or is some type of fat being used for fuel? So I'll show you what that means. So glucose is the simplest sugar. And because of that, we use glucose as the reference point for respiratory exchange ratio. And you'll notice here that here's 1 molecule of glucose, and it takes 6 molecules of oxygen to break this glucose down. And what results is the 32 ATPs that are so beneficial. And that's the whole reason we go through the Krebs cycle and use oxygen. And what's produced is 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. So you'll see, in order to break down glucose, you need 6 oxygens, and it results in 6 carbon dioxides. And the volume of carbon dioxide produced divided by the volume of oxygen consumed, which is 6 carbon dioxides, is what's produced, and 6 oxygens is what's utilized. That's a ratio of 1. And that's why the respiratory exchange ratio for 1 molecule of glucose is 1. But the respiratory exchange ratio for a fatty acid is different because fatty acids are more complex. So this is palmitic acid. And you'll see here it takes 32 molecules of oxygen to create 16 molecules of carbon dioxide. And the respiratory exchange ratio is the carbon dioxide is in the top and the VO2 is on the bottom. So if there's more oxygen, it's going to be a ratio that's less than 1. So if I have a respiratory exchange ratio, this guy's running on the treadmill and he's got a respiratory exchange ratio, right? This value says a respiratory exchange ratio of 1. Well, that means that I know he's probably using glucose as fuel. He's got to be using glucose for fuel. And if that's the case, he's definitely using oxygen to break that glucose down. Definitely. So he's definitely not into fast glycolysis. He's past fast glycolysis. So if I have an individual and they start on this treadmill and they're supposed to do a Bruce treadmill protocol, it's like run to complete and total fatigue. And they're going to be running for like 17 minutes, 15, 17 minutes, as high as they can go in terms of velocity, as high as they can go in terms of the incline. And if they tell me that they cannot go anymore, they're beat, they can't run anymore, but their respiratory exchange ratio is less than 1, to me, I know, well, they're not even into slow glycolysis yet. So even though they're telling me that they're done maybe mentally, and it's not something that they're having fun doing, physiologically, I know that they're not even into slow glycolysis yet. They're not even burning sugars. So I know that they have more effort that they can give in terms of this Bruce treadmill protocol. If the respiratory exchange ratio for a particular activity is 1 or higher, you know that they're using glucose. They're into their slow glycolysis and oxidizing glucose for fuel. At lower intensities, remember, you burn fats. So if you have a respiratory exchange ratio less than 1, it's an indicator of the change in substrate use from carbohydrate to fat. And this is, so if I have 100% fat mixture versus 100% carbohydrate mixture, you'll see that there's a change in the respiratory exchange ratio that's needed to get calories from each of these particular substrates. So as somebody's running on the treadmill, or if you're running on the treadmill and you see your respiratory exchange ratio, you can now make inferences of what energy is being spent. And now this is an indirect measurement, not only of the amount of calories, but also of the type, or where the calories are coming from. All right, so now all of this here is up in the air if protein is being oxidized. But we don't want protein to be oxidized if we're in an efficient nutrition and exercise state. All right, but this value of respiratory exchange ratio can be made lower if, rather than glycogen and glucose stores, you're creating new glucoses from broken down proteins. So this isn't 100% accurate. And now the indirect measurement of energy expenditure has some type of error involved. Remember, this is just an estimate. We're only estimating. And every estimate, because of the nature of the word estimate, is not 100% accurate. So we still have to be weary of the information that we gain from our indirect measurements of respiratory exchange ratio. There are other ways of indirectly measuring energy. You can do it by having this drink. Actually, what they do is they drink, it's called deuterium, and it breaks down over a period of time. It's a radioactive or non-radioactive, something that goes into the body, breaks down, and it tells you how much energy you've spent. We don't use that, obviously, but there are other ways of indirectly measuring energy. Another way of measuring energy is to use one of those energy calculators that I showed you at the beginning of the semester. It's health-calc.org or .com or whatever. I'll just health-calc. And then you can use these energy expenditure calculators, health-calc.com. And there's an energy expenditure calculator here that you can use. I think it's awesome. I use it with all my athletes and a lot of the lectures that I do on energy expenditure. And what you're looking at is the amount of, or the rate, the speed at which metabolism happens. Rate is always a velocity. So how fast does metabolism happen? If your resting metabolic rate goes up, it's an indicator that you're spending more energy. At rest, Most people are spending about 2,000 calories a day. But I would say that probably flips during the middle of the season, especially if he's working out every day, is probably spending close to like 3,000, 3,500 calories. And Michael Phelps, the Olympic medalist swimmer, best of all time, was probably spending close to 10,000 calories a day. In fact, I sat next to him at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado during breakfast, and he must have had 10 huge heaping plates of food. Unbelievable. So we can estimate your metabolic rate using your resting metabolic rate. And we can measure your resting metabolic rate. Let's clear these drawings. But the book actually talks, instead of resting metabolic rate for right now, it talks about basal metabolic rate. And basal metabolic rate is the absolute least amount of energy that you're spending at rest. So if you're laying on your back and you're in an environment where the temperature is controlled, so it's like 72 degrees, you're indoors, and you've been sleeping for 8 hours and you haven't had anything to eat. So remember, I said that there's 3 ways that your body is spending energy. One is on your basal metabolic rate, what you do during absolute, complete, total inactivity. And then it's the thermodynamic effects of food. And then it's all of the activity that you do. Those are the ways that you're spending your food, activities of daily living, or your other sources of energy, sports, exercise. So if you're lying in a supine position, it's eliminating all of these ADLs here. And if you're fasting, then we're not considering the amount of energy that's spent on the digestion and circulation of food through your GI. We're only now talking about your basal metabolic rate, the amount of energy it takes to be at complete and total rest. That's the minimum amount of energy required for living. For everybody on the call, it's probably between 1,500 to 1,800 calories. I calculated it last week. Mine was about 1,600 calories, so I'll just say 1,800. So about 1,500 to 1,800 calories your body needs just to have enough energy to even function. So if you don't have at least that 1,500 calories in your diet every day coming in, then you just don't have enough energy to even function. And eventually what's going to happen is your body is going to eat itself, and it's going to destroy its own tissues, and you'll have eventual, I have no scientific data to say that this, but eventually you're just going to have tissue breakdown and things are going to deteriorate. Not good. This is the absolute least amount of energy. So your body needs to at least eat this. Now, if I'm only eating 1,800 calories, I'm not going to be able to put on any muscle mass. And I really shouldn't be doing strength and conditioning. I really don't even have any calories to do any extra activity aside from just sleeping and not digesting any food. So for people who have ultra low carbohydrate or a low calorie diets, I just don't see how that's functional. Now, will it make you lose weight? Yeah, of course it will. But another good way of losing weight is to cut your leg off. You probably lose 17 pounds pretty quick. But obviously that's not the way to lose weight. There are beneficial and then there are detrimental ways of losing weight. So basal metabolic rate, though, is not something that's really practical. I can't measure basal metabolic rate. First of all, because I don't have one of those calorimeters. And in order to look at basal metabolic rate, you're gonna have somebody laying supine, laying down in this closed off environment for 24 hours, and you're gonna measure the change in water temperature. Same thing. I don't have one of those. So I'm not gonna be able to directly measure basal metabolic rate. So nobody really measures basal metabolic rate. People look more at the resting metabolic rate. And the resting metabolic rate can be estimated much easier than actually measuring all of this stuff. So most of the research will look at basal resting metabolic rate. And resting metabolic rate is related to the fat-free mass. I already showed you the equation that calculates that. So resting metabolic rate is equal to 500. Maybe this is easier. Let's click this. I've never done this before, but it should be 500 plus parentheses 22 times your fat-free mass. Well, that's even cleaner, like that. So 500, well, how do I select it? Select, that's how I select it. 500 plus 22 times your fat-free mass. Let's put that there. All right, so that's the equation that you can use for resting metabolic rate. You're going to get very similar results. It's going to, very, very small error margins, but it's just much easier. You don't have to have such stringent conditions where a person is, in solitary for 24 hours and fasting. Fat-free mass, how do you measure that? Well, you're going to measure that by doing your skin calipers. The easiest way to do the measurement of your percent body content, or your, I guess, the amount of fat mass that you have, is, for me, it's to get one of those bioelectrical impedance scales. They're at Target. I used to do the skin calipers in class. There's no reason for us to do skin calipers in class, right? Is it something that you might want to know when you go to demonstrate your abilities to somebody who's trying to hire you or whatever? Yes, I guess so. But I would just bring in a scale. I just bring a scale, a foam roller, a bungee, a couple of, I have like a kit of all of the stuff that I need. I go with a scale, and instead of pinching somebody's fat on the side of their belly, I would just say, step on the scale, and I can get you your body mass index, your body water content, your bone mineral density, your body composition. It's just much easier and faster. So what I am is about 25% body fat. All right, maybe a little bit less than that, but we'll go with that. So 25% body fat, and that's my fat mass. So my fat-free mass is going to be 75% of my body weight, and my body weight in kilograms is about 65 kilograms. So 65 kilograms times about 725. 65 times 75%. I'll do the math real quick. 65 times 0.75 is about 48.75. So this comes out to 48. Let's go 49. And then multiply 49 by 22. 49 by 22 equals 1,078, and add 500 to 1,078. I'm about 1,578 is my basal metabolic rate, or my resting metabolic rate, rather. So right in the middle of this 1,200 to 2,400 kilocalories per day. So if my diet has less than 1,578 calories, I just don't have enough money. It's pretty much the same thing. I don't have enough fuel or calories to even keep my body functioning. Now, the normal range of activities above and beyond that rest is about 1,800 calories. So let's say I'm 1,800 and 1,200 at the very minimum. I'm at 3,000 calories right there. So if I'm not eating 3,000 calories, I'm not even doing it. I'm not trying to put on muscle mass. I'm not trying to do anything. At the gym, I spot all day, every day. So I got about 6 hours of normal daily activities. If I'm not eating 3,000 calories, I'm not able to keep up with what I need just to rest and what I need to just do my daily activities. And like I said, some athletes might be way up there. Some endurance athletes who are doing long-term endurance, burning huge amounts of muscle glycogen and calories. So I would bet that Flips is anywhere from, I bet he's at 2,000 2,000 calories resting metabolic rate and probably another at least 2,000 calories to play football, I bet flips is up closer to like 4,000 to 4,500 calories. Now, the ladies who are playing lacrosse, they're going to be a little bit lower, right? Because remember, resting metabolic rate is correlated with fat-free mass. And just by nature, the ladies have less fat mass and therefore are going to be spending less energy. All right, but about, I would say for any of the athletes, 2,500 to 3,000 calories definitely each day. And that's what I recommend to my athletes at the gym. And they're like 10, 11, 12 years old. Now, all this is dependent upon the intensity of the exercise and whether or not you're utilizing oxygen or not. So exercise intensity increases, so does the need for more carbohydrate, protein, and fat breakdown. So one of the things that we can take a look at in terms of an estimate of energy expenditure is the amount of oxygen, simply the amount of oxygen that you're using. But that's really limited to lower bouts of exercise. You'll notice as this individual goes for longer and longer, the watts of the intensity of the exercise are represented by the height of the graph. And you'll notice that the more intense the exercise is, the more oxygen is required to do that particular bout of activity. So there's an increase in watts from 50 to 100 to 150 to 200 to 250 to 300 watts. And the amount of oxygen needed to overcome or to be able to complete that bout of activity had to increase until eventually the body just cannot pull in any more oxygen. It's topped out. It's reached its VO2 max, the amount of oxygen that is the highest that this person can reach. Now, even if the exercise gets more and more and more and more intense, it doesn't matter. This person's lungs aren't going to increase and expand exponentially. And at some point, this person reaches their maximum ability to utilize oxygen, their VO2 max. This is somewhat difficult to measure because usually prior to getting to the most intense bout of exercise, people usually want to stop already. So usually we get to a peak VO2, which is the highest VO2 that people could get to in that bout of exercise, but not as often do people actually measure their VO2 max. So sometimes we use the peak VO2 or the VO2 max as an indicator of the amount of energy that individual is spending. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any point. But there is some point. There is some point where the amount of oxygen that I can pull into my lungs just can't increase anymore. And it can't increase anymore because I have a limitation into the physical size of my lung capacity and the strength of my intercostal muscles and the expanding properties of my lungs because of the ribs, the strength of my diaphragm, the stiffness component of my lung tissue. These are all things that could be hindrances to the amount of oxygen that I can pull in at any point. So when I cannot pull in any oxygen, but the intensity of the exercise is increasing, that's my indicator of the maximum amount of oxygen that an individual can take. This is the best indicator of aerobic fitness. Individuals who are highly trained athletes in endurance running will have VO2 max values up towards 60 and 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute. 4, 5, 6 times what normal individuals would have. It's not necessarily the only or best indicator of performance, because there are things associated with performance that are above and beyond things that have to do with exercise physiology, like technique. Technique is not a physiological change. It's more of a technical change. It's just a physical change based on like how you're using your body, your limbs, levers, physics, torque. All right. So there are other things that are factoring into performance, but in regards to aerobic fitness, VO2 max is the best measurement. And you can work VO2 max training, but after about 12 weeks, there's going to be a kind of plateauing of an effect. Your performance will continue to improve, but these improvements will mostly be more due to training, exercise technique, training technique, also the utilization of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats different. So for a trained individual compared to an untrained individual, not only can an athlete who's trained work at higher speeds for a longer period of time, but so not only can they work for a greater duration. So this is the duration. An untrained athlete would have to stop at a particular time point. All right. But the individual who's trained has an expanded amount of time that they can continue. And not only are they able to stay on for a longer period of time, but you'll notice that the untrained individual has a peak VO2 max of about 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute. 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That is another way of saying 3.5. Yeah, let me hold off on this. I don't want to be confusing. So an individual who is trained not only can stay on the treadmill for longer, so they have a longer duration of exercise, but you'll notice that their VO2 max in some instances can top off at 60 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So training has a beneficial effect on VO2 max and sport performance. Usually VO2 max is measured in liters per minute, but it's a little bit misleading because some people are bigger than others. So this is a way of expressing it in absolute values, but then you can also normalize the value to body weight. So typically you'll see that VO2 max is presented in milliliters per kilogram per minute. And again, we said that ladies are going to have a little bit lower VO2 max, again, because there's less fat-free mass, less hemoglobin, smaller lung capacity. But remember, no activity is 100% aerobic or anaerobic. In the beginning of most activities where there's no oxygen demand because there's still ATP in the muscle, that's going to be an anaerobic event. So even just walking on a treadmill starts with an anaerobic effort. So again, the closest that we can get are just estimating our aerobic and anaerobic energy expenditure. There are a lot of competing factors. After you're done with a bout of exercise, there's, in many instances, more oxygen needed. Right? The body hasn't had the opportunity to relax or to rest from the exercise. So it could be the case that the amount of oxygen that you need to consume after exercise is more than the actual oxygen that's demanded of the activity. For instance, this value here represents the amount of oxygen that I'm spending. So let's just make this axis here, where down here is very little oxygen spent. All right, very little. So we'll put 3.5 liters per minute. This is rest. So right now I'm resting and I'm using the resting amount of oxygen. Then at some point after rest, I'm going to start exercising. I'm going to go outside, and right now I'm actually walking down the street and starting to exercise. So because I'm exercising, the amount of oxygen that I'm using is more than the amount of oxygen that I'm using at rest. How much oxygen is required? Well, let's say this is the amount of oxygen that I need in order to do my bout of activity, and that, say, is 6 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So this is what I need while I'm walking, and this is what I need while I'm resting. But when I start the exercise, my breathing rate doesn't go up immediately. It actually takes about 3 to 5 minutes for your breathing rate to get to your first VO2 max, or your first plateau of oxygen. And then once my breathing rate adjusts, my amount of oxygen that I'm pulling into the body is going to be consistent. And then let's say I stop exercising right now and I go back into a resting state. Well, when I go back to rest, the amount of oxygen that I need now is back down to this point. So when I start the exercise, even though the amount of oxygen that I need is 6 units, because like I've only walked now for like 5 seconds, now 10 seconds and 15 seconds. Eventually my heart rate, my breathing rate's going to go up. But in these beginning moments, my breathing rate is still pretty low, but the amount of oxygen needed is higher because I'm walking now. I just haven't been able to catch up to the oxygen demand because my breathing rate is still pretty shallow. Eventually, I'm going to start to breathe faster and faster and faster and be able to pull more oxygen into my body because of it. And I'll reach the amount of oxygen that I need to do that particular bout of exercise. But until this moment, right about here, like let's say it's like, I don't know, three minutes into the bout of exercise, this is 3 minutes, there's an amount of oxygen that I'm kind of like needing. I'm not quite able to get to. I'm not able to get to the 6 units of oxygen per minute that I need in order to function in this particular amount of time. So this here is known as the oxygen deficit. I'm performing a particular activity that requires this amount of oxygen, but until my breathing rate increases, I'm not going to be able to get the amount of oxygen needed. Then the activity commences for how much ever long it is, however long that period of time is. It could be 5 minutes, it could be an hour. And as long as the intensity of the exercise doesn't increase, the amount of oxygen needed to perform that particular exercise is going to plateau. Then the race is over. My 10K is over, and now I'm resting. And sometimes after the Olympic Games, the guys, the ladies, they'll run for like, a marathon. And when they're done with the marathon, immediately they lay down on the ground. Not always, but immediately let's say they collapse, boom. And at the end of that bout of exercise, they're pretty much resting. So the amount of oxygen needed then is this amount, rest. But they're sucking wind, still pulling in oxygen, still breathing heavy, breathing heavy, breathing heavy. They're pulling more oxygen in that's needed for that bout of exercise. And that's because they're recovering. It's the post-exercise recovery, the epoch. Individuals who are more well-trained have a shorter period of epoch and a shorter period of oxygen deficit than somebody who is well-trained, who is not trained at all. somebody who is well trained can recover much faster than somebody who is not trained at all. Feel free to interrupt me at any moment. Well, let's go and take a look at this animation here that's probably going to say something similar.
During the transition from rest to exercise, oxygen needs and oxygen supply differ, resulting in an oxygen deficit. During this phase, muscle contraction is supported by anaerobic energy sources. This deficit continues to accrue until oxygen consumption reaches the required or steady state O2 consumption. In a similar manner, when exercise stops, oxygen consumption doesn't immediately decrease back to its resting value. This excess oxygen consumption is known as the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC.
All right, so another way to estimate whether or not somebody is trained or therefore efficiently spending energy or metabolizing is to take a look at their blood lactate threshold, or the amount of lactate that is created by burning. Remember, lactate is created by burning pyruvic acid. So you have your carbohydrate as your C6H12O6, and that's going to be broken down into 2 pyruvates, which are your 3 carbon molecules. And that's going to happen 2 pyruvates. And that's going to happen without oxygen as a result of your fast glycolysis. So you have your 2 pyruvates. And the 2 pyruvates are going to get broken down into lactic acid outside of the mitochondria. And eventually that lactic acid is going to have to get shifted to the liver and processed. And there's going to be a rate at which the liver can produce sugars or glucose out of this free roaming lactic acid, but the liver can't do it that fast. So eventually the amount of lactate that is accumulated in your bloodstream is going to increase. Now, the faster that this process happens and the faster the liver can change the lactic acid back into glucose using gluconeogenesis, the better. And this process is going to happen much faster for somebody who is trained versus untrained. So if you take a look at the next slide here, this is a graph of somebody who's running, and you'll see that at a particular intensity of exercise, somewhat lower intensity exercise, there's not an appreciable increase in the lactate threshold. But as that individual continues in that bout of exercise, and you notice that its treadmill speed is increasing. So this is the increase in intensity of exercise. At low intensities, there's just not enough lactic acid being made, so the liver can deal with it, no problem. But at some point, the demand of the muscle is so high, the lactic acid is being created so quickly, the liver can't really deal with it, and eventually it starts to pool up in the bloodstream. That's going to make people sore and fatigued, and this is an indicator of endurance training. An individual who is better trained is going to have a delayed lactate threshold, so they're able to get to a more intense bout of exercise without having muscle fatigue and potential breakdown of tissue. So the higher the lactate threshold, the better the endurance performance. All right, so you can take lactate threshold to predict performance. Now it's somewhat difficult to so capacity, anaerobic capacity. Anaerobic is the ability to utilize ATP without the presence of oxygen. And remember, thus far, we've been talking about energy expenditure with oxygen. So here, now we're talking about measuring your anaerobic capacity, and there's no measurement like VO2 max for anaerobic capacity. There are a couple of tests that you can do. One of them is a Wingate test. You go onto a bike, you pedal as fast as you can for 30 seconds, and then you measure your heart rate, plug it into a bunch of like graphs and such, and that will give you an indicator of your anaerobic capacity as opposed to aerobic capacity. But there aren't as accurate of measurements. All right, and now another thing that we want to take into effect is that energy expenditure, the amount of energy spent, has a lot to do with technique. This is economy of effort. All right, so you're going to use less energy if you're doing better exercises, if you're wasting less energy, if you're not, you're supposed to run ear pocket, right? With your hands going to your ears in your pocket and not straightening your arms at the bottom and lifting your knees and keeping your front foot flexed. And all of those things are going to store more energy, and you'll be able to use more kinetic and potential energy and stored energy and elastic energy as opposed to caloric energy. So one of the reasons why, even though individuals have already reached their 8 to 12 weeks of increasing their VO2 max improvement, they can still increase their racing success by practicing and working on form. All right, so it's not only energy expenditure that results in, or it's not only the ability to break down carbohydrate, protein, and fat that and the utilization of VO2 and carbon dioxide that results in the burning of fuel, right? You can save fuel, save calories is another way of making your athletes more economic. So individuals who are highly trained will typically have high VO2 max. They have big lungs. They have good, strong intercostal muscles and diaphragms that can inhale and exhale effectively. Their liver works highly effectively in order to shuttle the lactic acid and the lactate out of the blood into the liver and switch it to fuel for later. They typically will have very good technique. And if you're an endurance athlete, typically you're going to be an endurance athlete because of, say, natural selection, in some instances because your genetic profile is going to support the utilization of VO2, oxygen, because you have type 1 muscle fiber types that are high in mitochondria and the enzymes that are needed to break down sugars and fats for fuel. Now, not every activity costs the same amount of energy. The way to figure out what activity or how much energy an activity costs, like I said, is take a look at your the internet sources that have various activities and their energy expenditure costs listed with them. A good resource is the MyFitnessPal app. I'm not sure if anybody's seen any of those things, but again, it's difficult because you're estimating. I'm not sure everybody's intensity, but the easiest way to find out the energy cost of various activities is to find out online. All right, now the chapter takes a little bit of a turn away from talking about energy expenditure and how to measure energy expenditure. And it starts to go into a discussion of fatigue and what the causes of fatigue are. And as the beginning of the chapter implies, some fatigue is caused by lack of energy, but other fatigues are caused by obviously other mechanisms. So there are two kind of definitions of fatigue. Number one is muscularly related, and another one is power or energy related. So it could be that your muscles are deteriorated, or it could be that your brain is tired. And if that's the case, then there's going to be slowness in the contractile rate or the that whole contraction process. Or it could be that your body just doesn't have enough fuel or energy to balance or to allow for the appropriate work done at the muscles. Fatigue is oftentimes reversible with rest, and that's a big difference between fatigue and maybe injury. So rest, if that's the case, then rest here is an incredible and a hugely valuable part of training. And I believe that the athletes that I work with should have almost as much rest as they have training. But you know, what's better than 1 a day? Flips is 2 a days, and what's better than 2 a days is 3 a days. But then all of a sudden people get fatigued, and it's just not physical fatigue, it's mental fatigue, right? It's health and wellness. They're all different aspects of wellness. So sometimes kids get mentally fatigued and they look like they're fine. Their bodies aren't sore or anything. They get mentally fatigued. They get fatigued because of social pressures and homework and all sorts of different aspects of fatigue. So I want to try to give my athletes an opportunity to rest, but I also do a lot of things to try to reduce fatigue. Like I do a lot of meditation in the gym. Now, meditation is kind of cool because what it does is it allows you to reduce stress. But another great thing about meditation is that usually the kids are lying down quietly. So meditation usually requires very little calories. And if it requires very little calories, and then they can still make their performance improvements because I'm improving their mental state, then I'm still improving their sport performance. I'm reducing fatigue, and I'm saving calories and giving them a way to reduce stress. So I do a lot of meditation with the guys. I think it's a very good way to have them learn how to reduce mental fatigue. And remember, a gymnast or any other sport or any other athlete is not just functioning in a mental vacuum, but it's the neural muscular system. So your neurons, your brain, your mental is always interacting with your muscles. So usually in the gym, I want to not only work strength, flexibility, all that, but I want to give them opportunities to work on their brain. So we do a lot of meditation to help my athletes rest and to learn how to rest. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt. So there are a number of different causes of fatigue. So it's not just this one thing. It's not it's not a physiological thing that you can pinpoint. Sometimes you'll have to maybe do a medical history or some type of an evaluation for your athlete to determine whether or not it's a training status issue, or is it a diet, or is it a rest issue. But the major causes of fatigue are going to be not enough food, or not the right kinds of food, or not or an inability to break down those foods for fuel. When you exercise, you're making like exhaust or smoke, or there's remnants of working out. There's byproducts. And if these accumulate, like lactic acid, if that accumulates, then the acidic nature of the blood can start to reduce the integrity of the cellular structures and the tissues, and that can result in soreness and potential fatigue. Another reason for fatigue could be a failure of the muscle contractile system because you don't have enough calcium, or there's not enough glucose for muscles to contract, or that there's not enough actin, there's not enough myosin, or there's not enough rest, there's not enough water. So potentially the ability for the muscle to contract is compromised. And the last potential cause for fatigue would be neural control of muscle contraction. So your brain is exhausted, or your brain, which is supposed to send signals to the 480 muscles, maybe the brain is sending signals too late, or it's fatigued in terms of its ability to recover, or it's not hydrated. So these would be the major potential causes for fatigue. So one cause of fatigue associated with bioenergetics is that there's too much phosphocreatine. All right. And when there's an accumulation of phosphocreatine and I'm not creating ATP, the phosphorus ions, the free phosphorus ions, as they accumulate, it's a potential source of fatigue. What it does is it refers to the fact that my body is not recycling ATP quick enough. Remember, this phosphocreatine system, the bioenergetics chapter said that rather than thinking of it as a source for energy from ATP, rather think of it as more of a recycling energetic system that's creating ATP out of all of these accumulated free phosphorus ions. So this accumulation of free phosphorus ions implies that the ATP isn't being recycled fast enough. And that could be a potential for fatigue. And the cause is that I just don't have enough ATP. And this is assuming that I'm doing a very quick bout of activity in the absence of oxygen. So this would be where the accumulation of the energy metabolism products starts to accumulate. And because of that, there's just not enough stored ATP. I mean, it's a good thing that this is going to happen probably pretty regularly, but it's not such a horrible thing, because then you can start to utilize sugars for fuel. So your body starts to do so. But when the glycogen is depleted, and when I don't have any muscle or liver storage forms of glucose because I'm 40 minutes into my run and I didn't eat the appropriate carbohydrate rich meal prior to that, well, now my glycogen reserves are depleted. My body has to start to create glycogen from glycogenolysis, adipose fat, gluconeogenesis, broken down parts of free fatty acids and proteins. And if my glycogen reserves are depleted, then that could be a particular source of fatigue. Now, the higher the intensity of exercise, the quicker this glycogen reserve is going to deplete. So one cause of fatigue could be the intensity of the exercise. But that's sort of indirect, because what's really at play is the intensity of the exercise is breaking down the glycogen too fast, or if I don't have enough glycogen stored. So the bigger answer is this understanding of glycogen stores and the need and the utilization of glycogen during those bouts of activity. I tell my guys in the gym, make sure that you're eating brown rice, keep up your glycogen reserves. All right, so a particular cause of fatigue could be low muscle glycogen. And that's going to be more of a factor in different muscle fiber types. All right, so the fiber types that are using oxygen are your slow muscle fiber types, slow twitch muscle fiber types. So these slow twitch muscle fiber types might have the potential to be more depleted in terms of oxygen and energy after bouts of slow endurance training. And remember, most bouts of activity are a combination of type 1, type 2, and type 2X muscle fiber types, most activities don't start with maximal intensity. Usually they start off in the blocks, they run for a bunch of steps, and ultimately they get to maximal intensity. But at the beginning, your type 1 muscle fiber types, or your low power, or your slow twitch muscle fiber types are particularly recruited first. And then as the intensity of the exercise increases, the faster twitch, more power type muscle fiber types will be recruited. So it could be the case that the fiber recruitment itself results in a delayed fatigue for these particular fibers. So this slide shows the difference between a fast twitch muscle fiber, which are white, and slow twitch muscle fiber types, which are darker colored. So this muscle has a bunch of, different kinds. These are probably type 2X muscle fiber types. And then this person does a bout of activity. And you'll notice that all of these, this is a fast twitch muscle fiber. This is a fast twitch, same thing as here. This fast twitch and this fast twitch muscle fiber type at the end of the activity still have a lot of muscle glycogen in them, but you'll notice all of the slow twitch muscle fiber types that surround them are all depleted of glycogen. See this cluster of type 2X fiber types, they still have muscle glycogen. So these fiber types, these fast twitch muscle fiber types, are able to hold on to muscle glycogen a little bit longer, which would result in less potential fatigue. So fiber types could have something to do with your reduction in glycogen. Different muscle groups are have different percentages of type 1, type 2 muscle fiber types. So depending upon the activity or the muscle groups that are used. All right, and also has to do with the rate that your liver can create glucose. So if your glycogenolysis or your gluconeogenesis ability is depleted, then that could also lead to low glycogen stores and low energy. All right, let's see where we're at now. So the potential causes of fatigue by metabolic byproducts are because of a lack of ATP, the phosphocreatine system recycling of ATP isn't happening fast enough. Or it could also be that there's an increase in heat. An increase in core temperature is another metabolic byproduct. Remember, 60% of the energy that is burned through metabolism is lost through heat. So if the core body temperature increases too much, then that's another indicator of fatigue. Actually, not an indicator, but it's a cause of fatigue. Most of the body systems will start to shut down after, the core temperature increases too much. Byproduct of your fast glycolysis is the production of lactic acid. And like any other acid, it's going to start to break down the tissues that it interacts with, particularly in anaerobic or lack of oxygen using breakdown of sugars during more intense power activities that last less than 10 to 30 seconds. And then this increase in acidity in the production of lactic acid could result into actual tissue breakdown. So like we said, one of the metabolic byproducts of exercise is this heat loss. And what heat does is it increases the rate of carbohydrate. So you're going to break down sugars and muscle glycogen faster in hotter environments. So we want to just make sure that you're aware. Maybe it's the environment that is a cause of fatigue. It's not necessarily just your caloric intake or muscle breakdown or neurological functioning, but just the environment itself. All right. With just very small changes in temperature, there are increases in fatigue. All right, there are ideal temperatures that it seems as though support the correct breakdown of food for fuel and such. It seems as though 11 degrees Celsius is the best temperature to run at. And the hotter the temperature gets, the more ineffective that individual is. So this is time to exhaustion. All right, you'll know that if the temperature is very low, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, this individual is able to go 81 minutes. If it increases to 51 degrees, it increases their time to exhaustion. So they're able to do a longer bout of exercise. And you'll see as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, the effects of this increase in temperature that they got in terms of the benefit here start to actually become more detrimental. I'm not sure what the result of having the Boston Marathon on October 22nd will be, but if it's 51 degrees Fahrenheit, which is probably pretty reasonable for that day, actually, maybe it's a reasonably good choice. Usually in April, the temperature is closer to about 65, 70. So I'm not sure if having the marathon later on in the year is going to be a good thing. And you'll notice that there's also a drop off in terms of the time to exhaustion with humidity. So there's like a sweet spot of temperature and humidity. So atmospheric pressure and atmospheric conditions have a lot to do with fatigue as well. Now, lactic acid is creating this acidic nature. All right, and this says that the accumulation of the acid in the muscles or in the muscle fibers or the interstitial fluid or the blood is going to decrease muscle pH. It's going to reduce the pH and make it so that it's acidic. And just like anything else, if cells are exposed to acids, they're not going to survive. They don't function well and they break down. But then you have things in your bloodstream like your sodium bicarbonate that helps to neutralize this. But a properly functioning liver, a good cool down that allows for the redistribution of lactic acid and getting the blood that is acidic into the liver so that you can go through gluconeogenesis is beneficial. So I have my guys do a pretty good 5 to 10 minute cool down, jumping jacks, push-ups, sit-ups, and run in place for 5 minutes at about 50% intensity, and that helps clear out the lactic acid. And that's why you want to have your athletes do a good cool down. Again, interrupt me if you have any questions. Another example or a reason for fatigue would be because my brain just can't send the signals effectively. I could be tired. It could be because I don't have enough acetylcholine. It could be because I have the synapses. I don't have the correct receptors for the neurotransmitters. It could be that I don't have enough hydration, so the action potential can't be sent. It could be the case that I don't have enough carbohydrate or blood glucose or glucose in my brain. It could be that I don't have enough sodium or potassium, so I can't create those changes in electrical potential to get to my 70 millivolts. And because of these changes here, they're all resulting in a reduction in the action potential's strength when it goes across the membrane. And if that's the case, then calcium isn't going to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So a tired brain, a brain that doesn't have blood glucose, is going to get fatigued easier, and it's going to negatively impact my muscle contractions. So I definitely want to have my athletes and their brains have enough caloric energy so that these things don't break down. Rest is huge. And by the time people are fatigued, usually it's a little bit too late already. As my guys are exercising, I try to look at things like their sweat, whether or not they're sweating the cheeks, whether or not they take their shirt off, whether or not they're resting against the wall, whether or not they have chapped lips, whether or not they have, like, just try to get any guides, any hints that I can. I don't want them to have discomfort. So by the time they get to that warning sign, I already want to have um, um, anticipated. So just making sure that when we do strength and conditioning and they're working on strength and power, that they have the appropriate 3-to-1 work to rest ratio. I use Tabata, or one of those timers that has, the green for on and red for off. And so I help them work on proper pacing, which is one of the reasons why I don't let them work out on their own, because I think if they do work out on their own, all the guys want to do is just lift more and more and more. All right, so I have to teach them how to pace themselves as they work out, and also go through an appropriate periodization chart, making sure that they're working hypertrophy at the right time of the year, so that I don't fatigue them unnecessarily by doing strength and conditioning during the middle of the season. And then another example of fatigue could be because of muscle soreness. And that could be because of the intensity of the exercise or from the long duration of the exercise. I took a couple of pictures here from the book. I'm sure you guys might have seen this. This is what an actin and myosin arrangement in a healthy marathon runner would look like prior to a race. You can see here your Z discs, your actin and myosin strands. This is prior to the race. This is a little bit of a blown up view, and you can still see there's the cellular integrity of the Z discs, and the actin and myosin are maintained. But then after the race, this is what it looks like. Right, this is the Z disc is smashed, and all the actin and myosin. It looks like a tornado went off. So one of the causes of muscle soreness is this micro damage or deterioration of this cellular integrity because of the intensity of the exercise. But that's what you want, because that micro damage is going to result in a release of growth hormone, is going to result in an endocrine response. Your steroid hormones, your testosterones are going to go across the lipid bilayer and go directly into the muscle fiber, so that there's protein synthesis. So a lot of this muscle soreness due to your high intensity or over reaching is important. It's going to result in soreness, but it results in soreness because what's happening is you're destroying your muscle fibers, and then they need to heal. And then typically what's going to happen is after your bout of strenuous exercise, there's going to be an accumulation of the acidity because of your lactic acid, and all of your tissues are destroyed. So what happens is there's going to be swelling. There's going to be an edema. There's going to be fluid or white blood cells that goes to those spaces between all of these destroyed cells. And then once those white blood cells get there, there's going to be a swelling, and the swelling is going to push other material out of the way. I'm going to shut my door so I don't have the what is that thing? It's the lawnmower. Give me a second. That'll be better. And just like any tissue that gets, damaged, there's going to be swelling. So this is called transient or athlete induced hypertrophy, or that's called the pump, right? You increase the fluid to the muscle acutely, and then there's going to be acute muscle swelling, but that'll disappear within a couple of minutes to hours. Right. I also just want to make sure that my athletes understand the difference between overreaching and pushing your muscles so that they, become sore and then get stronger. And then with something that's called delayed onset muscle soreness. All right. Now, delayed onset muscle soreness is it's like when you get sore 2 days after your 2 days after your bout of exercise. Usually it's pretty severe. All right. And it can actually cause some restrictions in your ability to do the bout of activity. So I do not want really my athletes to get to the point where their muscles are absolutely completely destroyed. Now, when you do eccentric muscle contractions, it exacerbates this destruction of your Z discs. Running downhill, sometimes people say, yeah, running downhill, I feel so sore the next day. Because what you're doing is you're literally expanding and stretching all of these the structural separations between the actin and myosin, and you're destroying the muscle fibers itself. Now, if I do that too much, it's obviously going to result in soreness. It has a lot to do with whether or not I'm doing eccentric contractions, and it's not caused by blood lactate problems. It's not caused by lactic acid. This is caused by muscle destruction. Now, I definitely want to cause some micro damage, but structural damage in some instances is just too much. All right, but again, some muscle damage is good because it's going to start hypertrophy. All right. Now, this is in the sarcomere Z disc, the anchoring points of the actin and myosin. This slide here is saying when I exercise, what happens is this. And if I don't rest, what's going to happen is there's going to be a good amount of structural damage. All right. And there's going to now be some type of inflammation and soreness. White blood cells, neutrophils, all these different types of cells are going to go and try to fix the problem. They're going to get any of these broken pieces of the muscle that are floating around in the blood. They're going to try to break those down. And because there's swelling, there's soreness. But after these neutrophils and all of these things fix the problem, then the swelling goes away and potentially the soreness goes away. But a potential cause of fatigue, and it's not necessarily fatigue in this case. Fatigue is different than muscle soreness and swelling due to muscle damage. And that muscle damage isn't necessarily bad, right? Because remember, you need to have an amount of muscle damage for your muscles to restructure and to synthesize actin and myosin. So you don't want to avoid all muscle damage. It's just you want to make sure that you understand that the eccentric muscle contractions and intensity without rest is going to result in just increased soreness, increased breakdown, and increase attempt for your immune system to fix those broken up cells, which is just going to cause soreness and inflammation. So how does delayed onset muscle soreness happen? We said high tension and muscle caused by eccentric muscle contractions causing muscle damage to the cell membranes. And then that's going to potentially, because the membrane, the muscle fibers, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it's not going to be able to distribute calcium as it may have done before. So I'm not going to be able to go through the normal cellular processes. The Z discs are all broken apart. So what's going to happen is there's going to be influx of white blood cells, neutrophils, to go to that particular site and try to reduce pain, increase the growth of muscle proteins, actin and myosin. It's going to start to swell. And so this is the chain of events, especially with your eccentric muscle contractions and damage to the muscle cells. That's going to result in swelling and result in soreness. All right, so rest is important. Rest, hydration, listening to my athletes tell me that they're sore. Usually we do Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, but like sometimes Friday, my athletes are beat. They're not eating well in school. They don't have anybody watching what they're eating. And for me to just keep piling on strength and conditioning without listening to them at some point, I just think that I'm going to break them down and then it's not really effective. So I just kind of listen to my athletes as much as I can. All right, let's see. So to reduce delayed onset muscle soreness, I want to make sure that we, so because your muscles aren't well trained, we want to make sure that we can work eccentric muscle capacity. So prior to doing strength and conditioning in June, for the entire month of May, we do all of the strength and conditioning exercises, but with very little weight. Start with like 3-pound weights, and the guys get super frustrated. They want to lift more. But what I'm doing is I'm building up their eccentric capacity. So we start with very low weight. We start with progression, gradually increase over the course of like 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks. All right. And then what we do is build into their workout the ability to handle eccentric muscle contraction. I also educate them as well. And the last potential source of soreness or fatigue is muscle cramps. And a lot of that has to do with hydration and such, heat. Right, but making sure that people are stretched and hydrated and rest is important. All right, let's listen to this here.
Exertional muscle cramping is a recognized part of strenuous physical activity or sport. If you play long enough, hard enough, or often enough, chances are you're going to experience a muscle cramp somewhere along the line. Anyone who's experienced exertional muscle cramping knows that this can be debilitating and stop you right in your tracks from exercising any further. The important thing to appreciate is that not all exertional muscle cramping is the same. That means that they can be prevented and should be prevented and treated differently. If there's an overworked, overloaded, and consequently fatigued or damaged muscle or muscle group, this can interrupt or disrupt the normal muscle tension control components, that is the Golgi tendon organs and the muscle spindles. This causes the muscle group to spontaneously contract. This can be treated by certainly stopping exercise and gently stretching, icing, and massaging the affected area. These kind of cramps can be prevented by better biomechanics, more appropriate level of exercise, and perhaps even increasing your fitness. On the other hand, extensive and repeated exercise with large sweat losses can cause a total body water and sodium deficit to the point that causes a contraction of the interstitial fluid space. That's where the nerve and muscle come together. This causes a hypersensitivity that could at first appear as muscle twitches or fasciculations, and that can evolve into widespread, maybe even wandering, full-blown muscle cramps. This needs to be treated with oral or intravenous fluid that has a substantial amount of sodium in it to correct the situation and better hydrate you. The good news is that both types of cramps are preventable.